Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the last session of the last day of Build. Thanks for coming. I'll try to get us out in a timely manner so you can enjoy the rest of your evening. I'll be talking, I'm program manager on PowerApps and Canvas apps in particular, and I'll be going through building apps using expressions, rules, and formulas, and how you stitch together an application in this world. It's a little different than most. But let me set the stage a little bit. How many of you all have used PowerApps? Fair number, excellent. So I don't have to cover too much of this. This one slide that kind of captures why we're doing this. You think about the off-the-shelf SaaS solutions that are available, the CRMs of the world. There's a small number of those. And if they hit your solution, great. If they don't hit your solution, whoa. You often have to turn to a custom solution of some kind. You pay somebody to go build something. It's expensive. It takes a lot of time. Maybe they're hiring you guys to do that kind of work, which is nice. But what ends up happening is you have a small number of those solutions that end up getting built. What we're all about is enabling those top two, but also enabling the masses to create applications, to build apps using PowerPoint and Excel and skills that they already have largely. To use those skills to build their apps and to proliferate, have many more custom solutions that are available, that are very tailored to every individual business's need. That is the business application platform, the thing we've been talking about for the last few months. It's about empowering everyone to build their applications. It's about being web and mobile and reliable and manageable and trackable and all those wonderful attributes that go with being a great platform. This picture is interesting, but pictorially, you have PowerApps and Power BI in the center. PowerApps is the part I'll be talking about the most. Connected to it is CDS for apps, for applications, and Microsoft Flow. We're very closely with them. Our cousins are Power BI and more the analytics side of the house. Together, we hope to build this platform on top of Azure, so it's all open to professional developers to come in and extend the system, but available to higher level people. People are coming from Office and from Dynamics to take advantage of it as well. So that's probably the biggest thing that's happened in the last few months that I don't know if everybody's aware of this change, but the CDS part of that in particular, you notice it's under the Dynamics banner. It's because we changed CDS that we had last year to make it based on Dynamics instead of the databases we used previously. So if you go to the PowerApps that we call the Maker Portal, and you look at your entities, these look a little different than they did last year. These are a subset of the entities that come from CRM. Oop, I'm on the wrong one. This is last year's. So it looks very similar, but you'll notice that I don't have things like the Maker Portal down here at the bottom. Let me log into the other one as well. So I have a list of entities here too. These will be a subset of the ones that ship with CRM. It's meant to be a core standard entity set that can be used across all the apps and for people to build custom apps on top of. And by leveraging that, the hope is that there'll be communication possible between the different apps and they can leverage the same resources. There's a bunch of silly ones I put in here, but like business unit, contact, these are all coming from CRM. You notice that this UI is slightly different than that UI. This is the CDS 1.0, we kind of call it, that was shipped last year. And this is CDS, the upgrade, that we're rolling out now. If you try to provision a CDS database right now, you will get a new one. You can't even create the old ones anymore. And we're in the process of coming up with a migration plan to move people from the old system to the new system. And just to give you a sense for where this new system comes from, there's the Canvas apps, which is what we always knew of PowerApps previously. But you can also go to a model-driven world in which you build the same kind of UI that you have in Dynamics. And so creating an app here, instead of creating a Canvas app like PowerApps did previously, it will instead bring up the Dynamics builders for an app, for a form, for a report, all the stuff that goes on in Dynamics. Now, you don't need a Dynamics subscription to use this. You need a PowerApps subscription. This is all baked in PowerApps now. Notice the header says PowerApps at the top. This works with Dynamics, but you don't have to be a Dynamics subscriber to take advantage of this work. And to prove the point even a little further, if you go advanced, you'll see the normal solution explorer that you expect to see from Dynamics, with the same assets, the same entities that I've been using both for Canvas and for the model-driven apps. So this is a major change for us. This is a replat, if you will, of that database around where we were previously, now onto something that's consistent and integrated with Dynamics world. Now, most of the demos I'm about to show you will be on the old world, because we're not quite have all the capabilities of the old world in the new world yet. We're very close. We're closing that gap every day, but there's things like relationships and expressions that don't quite work in CDS 2.0 yet. It's going to take a little still time to get there. So I'm going to be showing you stuff on the old system that shortly will be available in the new system. Just some examples. We have many customers that we've been working with. These are a couple that I've personally been interacting with. This is a bottler in Ohio that sends out trucks to figure out how much they need to reorder at different stores and different vending machines. They use a Power App in a phone form factor that's a Canvas app. It allows for scanning and GPS tracking, and it's connected to their backend database. But they also have these other front ends, which are more about analysis and understanding where things are going. Another example is Metro Bank in London. They use a tablet app there for customer service. When people walk into a bank, they use that to look them up and to assign them to a queue for the next teller to answer whatever their questions happen to be. It's all done through a Power App running on a tablet, and they have other form factors they work with as well. Okay, that's the preamble. What I'm going to be talking about today is building Canvas apps and the guts of it. The declarative logic that's very much like Excel that binds things together, creates dependencies within the application. The imperative logic, which goes beyond Excel, where you can have buttons that click, and they do things, and they update databases. And then finally, some advanced topics around connectors. I'll show you an example where I can call a SQL store procedure with parameters and get back a result. Something else that's new for us right now that's kind of exciting. And some other topics as well, depending on how much time we have in the end. So let me dive into it. 2 words. If you take 2 words away from what I'm telling you about Power Apps, the Canvas apps, it's about think Excel. It's all about Excel. This entire thing was inspired by Excel. It was inspired by those 2 questions below. How can we make it simple for people to build apps, as simple as using Excel and PowerPoint skills? And what if they could leverage all the existing knowledge that they already have? That would be an awesome place to be. And that was the hypothesis that led to building Power Apps, the Canvas apps that we know now today. There's really 2 kinds of logic. I'll talk about both of these. There's a declarative logic where you bind things together. You have a text box, it provides a value, you feed it to another value, on and on. And it's a pull model. If you think about a spreadsheet, you have one cell that references another cell. It's pulling the value from the other cell. The other cell doesn't push the value in. There's never a time in Excel where something over here is going to change something over there. Instead, it's always a pull model. And that's exactly the way Power Apps is. Imperative logic is more like Visual Basic, C#, everything other programming language you normally interact with. It's imperative. Do this thing. Do it right now, and do it in this order. And it's about pushing information. In Visual Basic, it was all about setting properties. I hit this button, okay, now change these properties and do this work. That's imperative logic. Power Apps has both of these. I'm going to focus on the declarative first, because if you can stay there, you're in a better place. It's easier to maintain your code. But there are cases where you have to go imperative, and we have facilities for that too. It's all built on formulas and controls. So the things that you bind together with formulas are the controls. So you build up an app with elements very much like PowerPoint, where you put down a text box, you put down a button, you configure them using properties that say its font size is blah, its border color is blah. And then you have formulas. Instead of saying a static constant, like saying the border color should be red, you can say the border color, if this value over there is less than 10, it should be red, otherwise it should be black. And you start building in these Excel expressions that do things like produce a color or produce a value that you can use as the properties for those controls. The product ships with a whole set of controls like sliders and rating buttons and text boxes and galleries and grids and all kinds of other cool things that you bind together using these formulas. That's your code. So references, like in Excel, would be B1, or B2, excuse me, is referencing A1. And so it's taking its value of 12 from A1. In PowerApps, you put down two text boxes. You can have one text box, its text property, which is what it displays, is equal to the text property of the other one. And if you change the first one, the second one just automatically follows on, very much like you would in Excel. It's exactly the same model, the same concept. And that was what we were trying to leverage by building this product. You can do references across sheets as well. So in Excel, you have sheet 1, bang, and then give a reference to a cell. In PowerApps, you don't have to do that so much, but all the controls and all the screens are live all the time. You can reference any other control anywhere else. So we'll show an example in a little bit where I have a gallery of items, and I pick one, and I go to a screen to edit that item. The screen to go to edit the item, it just references what was selected over there. Even though it's off screen, it doesn't matter. It's still available. It's still there, and a record that can be interacted with. So different from normal programming where it's all about, well, I'm going to instantiate the form. I'm going to tear down the form. And there's code to serialize and take care of any business or any cleanup or whatever. It's not like that here. All the screens are live all the time. It's really just a question of which screen is currently shown. There's a method for telling us which one you want. But it's as simple as flipping between them, which means you can reference anything you want anytime you want. Here's an example with 3 sliders. As I drag, they're R, G, and B. So I drag green up, it gets greener. Let's change it a little bit different. I'm just playing around. So those 3 sliders are controlling that background color, the fill color for that screen. Now the way they do that, and now I'm going to switch back. This whole time I've actually been in PowerApps flipping through screens. Part of what PowerApps does is it uses PowerPoint type concepts. So running a PowerPoint presentation in PowerApps is actually quite easy. I've got my slides here on the left. Those are the screens that make up my app. And as I've been walking through this presentation, I've been just switching from one screen to another to show you something. Which means I can put live content on my screens like I showed you here. At the top of this screen, I have a formula bar, very much like Excel. I've got controls like sliders. They have different values. The fill color for the background, that's equal to an RGBA, which is a function, which converts numbers to a color. And I give it the slider 1 value for red, slider 2 value for green, blue, and opacity of 100%. As I change these values, that formula gets recalculated automatically for me. There's no on-change event for the slider that says, okay, I've changed, go recalc and change. No, the dependency's already been established that says the fill color depends on those sliders. Change the sliders, the fill color will automatically change out from under you. You don't have to do any of that programming. So it's like the application is recalcing all the time. As things change, it recalcs, takes into account the new data, and moves on. So state management becomes a really interesting thing in this world, and I'll talk about state in a little bit. You notice as I get these darker, it gets really hard to read these numbers. One way to fix that would be to have their color be dependent on the value. So I can say if slider 1's value, if I can spell it right, let's make it white, otherwise make it black. And as soon as I put the end paren, it compiles it, starts interpreting it, and now you see that it's white. As I change this up here, it becomes black again. Again, it's just something that's happening automatically. I don't have to think about it. It's just recalc of the app. What this means is your app ends up being a whole lot of little formulas, which initially is a little weird. But as you work with it, you understand that you don't have to think so hard about where values are coming from. In imperative programming, any part of my program could go whack the fill color and tell it, okay, I want you to give a new value. And you have to think about all the different places that could imperatively change that value. In this world, you just have to go to the fill color, and whatever expression is there, that's it. There's no other way that fill color changes except by that expression. So if you understand that expression, if you understand all the inputs to that expression, you've got the whole thing. You understand how fill is managed. But this is a listing of the expressions for one of our sample apps. You know, they get a little bit more complicated. If this is blank, lookup, you're looking up data, there's facilities for doing these things. But at the end of the day, like text is going to be a declarative operation. It's going to be doing this lookup effectively all the time, but in reality, it's smart enough to know to only do it when things actually change. I want to talk about this just for a second because it confuses some people. There's different kinds of properties. There's input properties, and there's output properties, and there's both properties. At the bottom of my screen here, I have a simple wiring like we talked about before, where I can type values in here, and this little text box is taking them into account. The wiring behind this is like we showed in that slide previously, where the text property for this guy is equal to the text property for that guy. There's a simple dependency there. This text property is known as an input-output property. It can take a value in, and it can also produce it out the other end. These are all input properties on this dropdown. Those are the things you can change, the things you can set. But there's output properties for which you can't set them, that they are derived by the control. The control is a slider. It has a default value coming in, but it also has what the current user set going out. And those are output properties. Those show up either in IntelliSense when you're typing, or if you go to the Advanced tab, you get a listing, sorry, this is more of the input. It's really about the IntelliSense. So as you're doing things here, you get a list of all the properties that are available to you that you can use in formulas. Put that back before I break anything. We take a lot of lessons from Excel. If you know how to do it in Excel, we're trying to leverage that as much as possible. This is a list of all the functions that are available in PowerApps. All the green ones are the ones that are very nearly the same as what you got in Excel. There might be small deviations, but in general, it's the same thing. And so every time something comes up, every time we need to add something more, and sometimes we actually even go talk to the Excel team, like, how would you do this? And get a feeling for where they're headed. But like the switch statement, we talked to them about how they were going to do that and work together to ensure that we had the same concept, the same syntax for how to use it. So if you know Excel, the idea is that you can leverage that to make good use here. To the point where if you have a problem like reverse string search, okay, this is finding the last word on the string. This is from Stack Overflow, which gives this little complicated formula for how to do it in Excel. Literally that same formula is being used here in PowerApps to do the same work. Quickly go through this. There's primitive data types like numbers and text, booleans, date times, similar to Excel, but a little richer than Excel has. They're all nullable, so there's an isBlank, and there's a blank function to return a null, which is important for database folks. There's also compound data types. You can have a record, which is very similar to JSON syntax. There's a curly brace, name, and then a value. Tables, there's a table function that returns a table. There's also a shorthand for doing a single column table, which is our form of an array. We don't have any specific arrays. A table that's one-dimensional. It's pretty much as close as we come. It can be arbitrarily nested either way, records in the table, tables and records, as much as deep as you want. And there are table functions. So a table is an actual value. It is something that you can pass around, you can return from functions, and you can use as arguments directly. It's particularly interesting. This is how we build queries. So if you're going to do a filter of a table, you say filter, you give the table, and you give the predicates that are based on that table. And there's row syntax for our context that's created that says those field names, they show up directly. So it's easier to get to them. Then there's data sources. This is an external source of tabular data. So a SQL table. comes into our system as a table that we can reason about. A SharePoint list comes as a table. CDS entity comes as a table. Galleries, display forms, and data tables help you display that and interact with it. And then there's a set of UI controls like those, and there's a set of functions for directly interacting. If you want to write the equivalent of an update query, you do that through the patch function or the collect function. In addition to these kind of data sources, there's also just API calls. I'll talk about connectors a little bit, but they're not all tabular. There's ones where they just have method calls, like the Microsoft Translator. You can call it and say, translate this string into French, and it'll happily do that for you and give you back a string. They're not tabular. There's not a table of information going back and forth. They're very much imperative. They're very much about calling a method. There's a whole bunch of those. There's a couple hundred of those. Relational data, especially in CDS, well, that's what we're doing at the most. You want to be able to easily move from a baseline entity to a lookup, or to the things in a many-to-one relationship, or you want to get to the things that, like order lines that hang off an order, in a one-to-many relationship. We want to make that as simple as possible to interact with, make it easy. So we've devised this syntax and this approach where you say sales order, you say account, you say contact, you say full name. We'll walk those entities for you until we get to the thing you want. And we'll jump across entities and do the appropriate filtering and lookups based on primary keys, and we'll do all that gobbledygook for you. We'll also do the same thing for sales order and sales order lines. We'll filter down that other table to the ones that are appropriate for this sales order. So you don't have to think about that either. So here's an example of a schema extract from CDS showing sales order lines, just a small subset of what you normally have. The author's logical view of that today is, if you just look at the orders table, it's flat. You don't have much information about the lookups. But where we're moving to is a world in which it's automatically expanded for you. It expands out the lookups to the full information that's available on the foreign entity, and it expands out the many-to-ones and pulls in that filtered table of information like order lines. Now that could be a whole bunch of information. There's a lot of dots down there on that bottom part. We're smart about the analysis. We know what we can bring in, what you have referenced in your app, and only bring in that information. If you haven't referenced it anywhere in your app, we don't bother. And so we can control how much data actually gets fetched by looking at your app and understanding its usage pattern. And that's part of our analysis and part of how we can understand how your app is used and make it work well for you. So with that, let me actually show you a real demo. First off, I've created a data source that connects to the common data service. I'm using the experimental connector. This is the one that supports relationships in the current version of CDS. The new version of CDS has this just built in directly. I'm only referencing sales order. So I'm not pulling in any other entities directly. First thing I'm going to do is bring a gallery to view the items that are in that entity. At this point, it's going to go do the fetch of the information I need. And so I've got this view of those two orders here. And it presents it in a simple little card that knows that's not very useful, is it? It knows what fields are interesting because it's been tailored to that standard entity. Part of the benefit of using the standard entities, there's a bunch of UI hints that we can provide in the system to make this look nice and interact really well. But right now, this doesn't do a whole lot. I can switch between them. Not terribly interesting. What I can do is I can insert a form to connect to it. I'll connect it to the same data source so it knows what fields to interact with. And so it's going to build me a form, put the fields in place based on their data types. Now, the key piece that's missing here is I haven't told it which of my orders I want to look at. To do that on the form, I tell it the item I want, I just tell it gallery1.selected. This is an output property on the gallery that always is providing the item in the gallery that I'm interacting with. And so as I move between these, the form automatically snaps to show that information. Now this list of fields, I can tell it what fields I want to have in my form. And I can tell it I want to add the account field. That brings on another card. These cards I can resize and move around and reorder all I want. Things just kind of float around to accommodate. But anyway, I'm interacting with that form and setting it up the way I want it to be. Next I'm going to do is, let's see the line items for that order. For that, I'll put a data table down. This is an items property, so I'm going to feed it not just one item, but a set of items, because it's a table. And in this case, I'm going to send it the selected items and the sales order lines. So it's already showing me 2 of those. Let's get something a little more interesting. So now it's showing the product name for the items that are in that list. As I move between items, the table updates automatically to show me the filtered set of that relationship. So I'm seeing multiple tables here interacting just by connecting the dots, by saying, okay, whatever's selected over here, let's see more details of that over there, and just feeding it the information. And again, no imperative. There's no on change, on click, nothing. I'm just playing, just wiring things together. Now, we talk about a couple other things. PowerApps has a fairly sophisticated query engine. It can do a lot of filtering and work on its own on the client. The problem with that is you have to move the data to the client, and you don't want to do that, obviously. If you have a 1,000,000-row table, you do not want to do a filter based on some predicate to find the needle in the haystack, the 1 row out of 1,000,000, by bringing all 1,000,000 down to the client. You want to be able to push that predicate to the server. We call pushing that delegation. And everything I just did is fully delegable. It's fully able to be pushed up there, and all the work will be done there. We'll just get the results back here. That's not always the case. PowerApps has the richness of Excel. Imagine you want to compare the quantity with the square root of the something. In Excel, you have this very rich expression language, and we have that in PowerApps. You can write things that there's no way you could ever push that to SQL, or you could push it onto OData. And for those, you need to kind of avoid them, and we need to flag them for you. So if we go back to this expression, the sales order lines, if I put a filter on here that says I want to filter that based on, let's take the rightmost character of the product name. Let's just show the ones that ends with an S. And it's doing it. It's showing me just the one, right? And if I switch to the other one, I get the other one that only has an S on the end. It's performing what it should do. And as long as the set that came back initially is small, we're good. In particular, if it's less than 500 records, we're good. It can do the remainder of the filtering locally. But if you go beyond 500 records, then we might be losing data. We might not be getting all the picture. So for orders where there's a cap of 500, we had no problem. You get this blue dot, we call it the blue dot of shame, error, warning, suggestion, that says there might be a problem here. You may want to try to simplify this, not use the square root of the inverse sign of blah to do your predicates. Instead, keep it simple so that we can push it to SQL and can push it to CDS and make good use of it. Also, that 500 record limit, there's a setting for that now. I know it says experimental. It doesn't mean it. It's a real feature that we're not going to take away. There's a value down here of 500. You can turn that up to 2,000. If you know that your situation, that would be appropriate. You can also turn it down to 1, which is also very interesting, because if you do that, you can detect where there's problems in your app with delegation. Part of the problem we face is that people will build apps that aren't delegating well, and they'll be like, this is a great proof of concept, let's go deploy it. And then it doesn't scale. This is a good way to find out if it's not scaling, is to turn it down. And then you'll get 1 record and you'll know something's wrong. As I say, this is a permanent feature. It is incorrectly labeled back here right now. We will be fixing that. So there's a list of delegatable data sources. There's an article about the overview of delegation and how it's used and what functions in PowerApps can be delegated and which ones cannot in general. Rules. Part of our mission is to replace InfoPath. InfoPath had very simple rules that were like, if this is true, do this other thing. They were voiced very much in an imperative style. But as I've shown you, we're really not about the imperative thing. We're about declarative. And so we had to shoehorn that in somehow. So let me show you an example of how that works. If I go to, let's say, total amount. If I go to this text box, I can define a rule on it. I can say the value of that text box is less than 10, let's say. And it puts me in this funny mode where it's recording my actions, kind of like a macro recorder, a little bit. So that in trying to make it simple, I'm not sure it did, but that was the intent. You're in this mode where I can go change things. Like I can change the color of that font instead of its normal color. I can change it to red. Why that's red, I don't know. Ooh, that's funny. What it'll end up building is a formula for me that uses a macro internally to convert it into a declarative method. And so that's what rules are about. They are not any different than the regular formula stuff I've been showing you otherwise. It is meant as a veneer on top of that that makes it easier for people to interact with. Okay. Let's talk about imperative logic. Excel, God bless it, doesn't have events, doesn't have buttons, doesn't have a way to change things at all. If you think about it, Excel really doesn't have a button. You can insert an OLE button and it can run some VBA, but it's completely outside of the normal calculation engine that is Excel. It's a bolt-on. Apps need that stuff. Everybody expects a button. Everybody expects to be able to interact with it and do things as a user to drive it, other than just viewing the information that Excel would provide. And so we had to bolt something on ourselves, and that's what we did. So beyond Excel, you should avoid it where you can. Declarative logic, as I've said, is easier, and we found this time and time again with the kind of apps that come back to us, where people get confused and they fall back into imperative world. It gets hard. It's really not designed for that. But you can do it. And there's a button on select, which is when you click. There's a screen on visible. There's an app on start. There's a bunch of events that you can wire into and have it do work on your behalf. And you chain those together with a semicolon, or if you were in various locales where semicolons used for something else, you use double semicolon. Set of variables value, change screens, etc. There's a set of variables, state variables. For the most part, everything I've shown you so far, and as much as we can, we try to keep the state in the controls. As an author, you shouldn't have to think about managing your own state. But it's inevitable. Sometimes you have to. And when you do, there's three kinds of state that you can interact with. One's global variables. They're the simplest to use. There's a set function. You set a variable equal to a value. Done. And you can reference that value anywhere in the application. Older is context variables. These are scoped to a particular screen. And with the navigate function, they can be used to pass parameters essentially into that screen. So they're useful in that regard. And then there's collections, which make a copy of tables, really, which are also global scope, so you can use them everywhere. But if you are doing offline activities, for example, if you want to make a copy of some table out of SQL, stuff it on this local device for later, you put it in a collection, and then you serialize that collection. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. These are the imperative functions. I showed you the declarative ones earlier. These are the ones on the imperative side of it. There's not as many of them, thankfully. But these are the guys you won't find in Excel, because they don't make any sense there. Talk about this for a second. I've already kind of mentioned it, but we do analysis of the entire application. It's a closed system to us. We look at all the different ways things are used. And the reason I bring it up here is that you don't declare your variables. You just start using a variable. You say collect my table, comma, some SQL table. My table automatically inherits the schema for the other SQL table. It does that analysis. And if you do collects from two different places, it does the join of the two automatically for you. It does a bunch of work on your behalf in that manner. Strings, numbers, tables, the schema of tables, that's all managed on your behalf. It also does dependency analysis, which is something Excel does as well. You can't do cycles. You can't have one thing to another that loops on itself, or bad things would happen. So that kind of analysis goes on, and occasionally if you wire out two controls to point to each other in a loop, it'll error that out for you and say, no, you can't do that. So let me give you an example of more of an imperative screen. Everything I showed you before wasn't imperative at all. This one is. So if I say a world, put a priority on it, add to the collection, it added it to a variable behind the scenes. And then this table is like the table before, but it's reflecting what's coming off that collection I just added to. So you know I can do this all day long, right? And there's a way to clear it as well. It all goes away. Behind the scenes, this button is doing a collect to my collection, and it's giving it a record saying priority, order. Order being, it just increments because it's counting the number of items that are already in the collection and just adding one to it and then adding that to the collection. That statement defined the schema for my collection. I didn't have to do it anywhere else. This is just the way I happen to be using it. And because of that, it created in the background. Things like collections are available in the backstage. So if you go to My Collection, you see a simple representation of what's in that table, and you can drill into it. Variables are also back here on the different screens, and the ones that are global. The ones that are table-based, you have to drill into, and you can see the table. This happens to be a table of images. It also shows you the references and the uses and indirect uses for each of those variables. So you can map it out, because it's doing all that analysis to understand everything's used. Kind of like Excel, where it'll give you a dependency chain between things. This is kind of like that. One of the things that's really important to do in PowerApps is move from screen to screen, change screens. Screen navigation is how you do that. There's a navigate function. It's one of the imperative functions. You give it a screen name. You give it a transition. Like PowerPoint, we have like fly in and swipe and a small set of those, not nearly as many as PowerPoint. But there's a small set of transitions you can use. I'm just using none for most of these. And then a context. If you want to pass a variable into the screen, you can do that as well. So as an example, if you look at these slides, quote unquote, that I've been interacting with, there's an image control back here. This whole deck actually started as a PowerPoint deck, and we'll make that available as the show's normal PowerPoint, so you can get to this information. But all I did was I told PowerPoint, please serialize all those out as images, and I imported those images into PowerApps. So this image control is pointing its image as the slide navigation. Back here on the backstage, there's a media collection for images, videos, audio. Here's all the slides that were exported from PowerPoint. If you look at, I just did it. If you look at the onSelect, sorry, there's the image. The onSelect says navigate to AFD1, and there's no transition, which just means it goes to the next screen. So I click it, and it goes. That's all there is to it. On each of these slides, I also have a transparent image on the other side, and all it does, it says back. It keeps a history chain of the different navigations you've done, so you can go backwards as well, very easily. This also brings up something else that PowerApps does, very much like Excel. I'm not ever in design time versus runtime. You notice that when I clicked, it took me there, because it's live. Everything that I do at design time, this is a running application, very much like Excel. You're in Excel, you never go into, okay, I'm gonna edit my formulas now. You're just whacking the formulas, and it's calculating on your behalf behind the scenes. That's true here as well, which makes application development much more rapid, because you can just interact with it, try things directly in the environment without having to even hit preview to go see things. You can just do it directly here on the screen. And in this example, I'm going to pass a value. Instead of doing just the navigate with no context variable, I'm going to go navigate with a value. And then I had this screen show whatever that value happened to be. So if I look at text equals message, message is a context variable that was created by this navigate call. Message equals text box, text input 1. So I'm just passing that value to the navigate, kind of like a parameter to the other screen. Now, putting all that stuff together, we have something we call app from data. I'm going to kick it off in the background so we can see the result of it. When you fire up PowerApps for the first time, you can create an app from data, which is what we'll be doing, and it gives you a set of data sources, as well as the full list of data sources. You can add a connection. Any of these connections can be used to create that app. Or, what did I just do? Or you can create from blank, or from a template. The templates are a set of apps that we've created that are already wired together that you can use as a sample to get started, or you can just start with a blank. But in this case, I'm going to do it from CDS. It will think. It'll give me choices. I'll use a count, sure. And it'll go off and do that. So I'm going to let that run for a second. Back here, let's talk about what it's doing. It's creating a 3-screen app for me. It's creating a screen, very much for a phone, where there's a browse screen where I can see the different items in the gallery, like we've already been seeing. There's a detail screen where I can see an item up close and personal. And there's an edit screen where I can actually see text boxes, and I can actually put new values in it. And I can hit submit, and I can hit delete, and I can interact with the data and change it. From a data flow perspective on that gallery, it's very much like we did before. The gallery is going to be wired to the table. The only thing is it's going to pass through a filter. It's going to pass through a sort as functions. And so we'll take a look at that in a second, but it's going to use those functions to do different operations. The up-down arrow will be connected to a context variable, which will determine which way it goes up and down. We really should have a up-down button that holds its own state. We don't have that yet. So use that same button and just manually set it using your own state variable. And the search box drives the filter. It drives selected over to the detail screen, over to the edit screen, just like we did previously. No difference. Those guys have buttons for submitting changes on the edit screen, for deleting on the detail screen. And there's functions called submit form, remove, that are used to drive that data back into the database. From a navigation standpoint, there's navigates from the browse screen when you select an item to the detail screen. And from there, you can hit the pencil to go to the edit screen and back again. But you notice that there's all these flows going on. There's flows of control flow for the navigates. There's data flow for the information flowing around. It's all little pieces of information. Each one of those represents a formula that binds one part of the app to the other. So here's what I built. Here's my browse screen. Its items function, items property, is set to sort by columns of a search. So this is the filtering and sorting that we expected. And it's using different parameters, like the text box coming out of the search box, whether it's up or down, but depending on this context variable. And it also has its onSelect. Sorry. Oh, it's using the old school. Thank you. We actually changed this recently. I won't go into that. But yes, you have to hit the arrow on this version. And I'll do the navigation to the detail screen. And then down here, I have the detail screen. It has things like this button for doing remove, button for going over the edit form. This is the wiring that makes up this app. So this 3-screen app was created that has this wiring, and it's ready to go. And from here, a person can configure it and say, I want these fields, I don't want those other fields, and go on their merry way. All right. Let's get into a few advanced topics before I try to get you out of here. Connectors. There's a bunch of them that are shared between Flow, PowerApps, and Logic Apps, and Power BI. There's a whole group that just manages the connectors. And you can create your own custom connectors, which a lot of people do. Put up on Azure, and then you can use that as your source of information. Wow, that's fuzzy. Okay, that's freaky. It's not just my eyes, right? It's fuzzy. Okay, well, we'll go with it. I have no idea what just happened there. Tabular connectors are the ones we use for CDS, for SQL, et cetera. They make CRUD operations easy. They make it easy to do those create, read, update, deletes. There's only a handful of the connectors that do support tabular, though. SQL and SharePoint, the ones I've been mentioning, Salesforce, MySQL, it's a small set. Most of the connectors interact with methods. And some of them do both. If you take the SQL connector, it can return tables as tabular data, but it can also expose methods that allow you to call stored procedures and do other operations on SQL. If a connector has tabular support, PowerApps will favor that, and it will not allow you to get to the other good stuff. There's a problem. It's something we're working on. But right now, from PowerApps, you cannot connect to a SQL database and call a stored procedure on it directly. Instead, you have to go through a different mechanism, which I'll explain in a second. Something we are working on. But there is this difference, the tabular versus the not. Flow really interacts with the non-tabular. They don't actually do tabular. But PowerApps can initiate a flow, and as of recently, it can get the return value from the flow. So you can call a flow, and it can call the stored procedure, pass it parameters, get the result back from the stored procedure, and then return that into PowerApps. Yay. Part of what's going on here is that PowerApps doesn't do such a great job with dynamic schema. And that's something we're also working on. If you think about a stored procedure, the connector itself, it's going to be like, well, I don't know what your stored procedure does. It's going to have its own schema. I can't tell you that ahead of time. It's going to be dynamic. You're going to have to deal with it on the fly. And PowerApps, because we're so strongly typed and all analysis is going on, we can't do that right now. But Flow can. Flow is smart enough to get the schema based on the data that it gets back. So I won't make you read. I have no idea what happened there. That's crazy. Here in PowerApps, there is a flow button, flows button, and we're going to create a new flow. It's going to start off with a PowerApps entry point, and we're going to give it an action to do, which is the store procedure. I only have one SQL connector right now installed in this environment, so it's using that one, and it found the store procedures for it. And it knows about, and it takes a parameter, so I'll say Colorado. Just so you know what this all looks like, here it is in SSMS. Here is the Sprock's definition. This is the AdventureWorks database. I've got a bunch of tables there. I've got this query that's doing a join across a bunch of them to find out the orders that are based in a particular state. And I pass as a parameter so I can just return the totals for that state, for that customer by that state. If I run it, I get this kind of output. I pass into California, I get back a table of values. Total sales for this customer that happens to belong to that state. Just an example. Back over in Flow, I can pass Colorado in there. I can save that. I have to give it a different name. And then I can run it. Do some checks, everything turned out okay. If we look at the output from my store procedure call, I've got this JSON, which is showing a table of just one item, which is a write. My table 1 is that result. That's the stuff I want. So this is pretty straightforward so far. What I'm about to do, I wouldn't call it a hack, but it's not exactly obvious. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cut and paste this schema, this result, this table. And I'm going to edit this workflow and add another step. Response. Here I'm adding a response action in Flow. And there's this little link down here at the bottom that says, use sample payload to generate the schema. I'm going to cut that result I got from the Sprock directly in here. And it's going to analyze that and produce the schema for me, which is great. Now I can take and I can pass that table 1 directly to this response action that came out of the store procedure. And now that we're done testing it and getting that sample data back, I can make it ask that information for me in PowerApps. So now I'm going to pass a parameter from PowerApps into the store procedure. I'm going to get the result from the store procedure. I'm going to send it to the response action. It's going to JSON it for me and provide it back to PowerApps. Which isn't that one. Sorry? Yeah, you can do it. I'm using store procedure. You can do anything you want in there. I'm just using this as an example. We have a lot of people that ask about store procedures. That's why I do it. But there, you can put any action, any set of actions in there that you want, and use whatever parameters you want, and response you want. It all would be great. Let me do. Aha. Gotcha. Okay, back to PowerApps. It miraculously already knows about my flow, so I can insert that. Now it did on visible, it's saying to call it. That's not really what I want. I'm not sure why it defaults to that, but it does. I'll take that away. I've got this button here that I want to actually do the querying. And that's where I'm going to want to put it. And then I'm going to want to take that from the text input box. So I can put Colorado or New Mexico or whatever I want here. Now this is an imperative function. It's not going to continuously provide this data. It's not going to automatically refresh it, not like the tabular connectors would. So here, again, I'm going to use a variable. I'm going to use a collection. Collect adds the end. Clear collect wipes out what's already there and adds it to the end. So for this case, if I want to set the collection, that's what I want to do here. So create a new collection, call it state sales, and give this value. And then this table that I've got here, let's set it equal to that value. Now I can put England in here. Not a state it's true, but it is in the database that way. Call it, it whirls, ants march. Don't see anything, but that's because I didn't tell it what fields to show here. Let's do that. I tell you, I'm not having a good demo day. Did I spell it wrong? Which one? Oh, I spelled New Mexico wrong? Given I grew up there, you'd think I'd get that right. Okay, well, guess what? What's cool about this is that Flow keeps track of all the runs. Oh, maybe I didn't save this. Is that the problem? That's probably what happened. Of course. Okay, let's get out of that then. I just said save. Really, I did. It does keep this run history. Hey, it looks like it should be working. Here's the response, here's the schema. Ooh, there's nothing in there. What do we get back from the stored procedure? Ooh, nothing. What happened up here? Did I mess up that? Text input 1? Oh, it's probably not that, is it? Customer state, that's what the problem is. It's some other control somewhere. See, all of us together, we can debug it. It's awesome. Now we get something. There we go. So now for each of those runs, it's calling the store procedure, it's going through the flow, and it's coming back into PowerApps and populating this table for us. So as I said, you can use this for any number of things. It's not just store procedure specific in any way. And then now this is nice and big. Well, who knows? Well, let's talk about this for a second. Changing values. There's no two-way data binding in PowerApps. So if you have a variable and you want to have a text box for the user to interact with it, you can't just bind it and then have changes go back and forth. Again, that's that whole cycle thing that would be a problem in Excel. You don't want that to be happening here either. So what ends up happening is there's two properties on that text box. There's a default property, which is the input, its current value, and then there's an output property. And so you feed default with what the current value is coming out of a database, for example. And you take the output property and you use that to change the database based on the user making a change to that value. You don't want to cycle it. You don't want to take the output and run to the input in some manner. That would be a cycle. That's uncool. What you can do is you can put an imperative action in that loop. If you think about a database, You're going to be bringing values to the current record into your UI. You're making changes to them. At some point, you're going to say submit, where there's going to be at least an auto-submit of some kind. That imperative action is kind of a gate. It allows that value that's been changed to now make it into the database and to come back around. And that kind of a cycle is fine. It's controlled by some kind of user interaction or a timer or something that's not just automatically, infinitely recalcing. And that's what we're trying to avoid. So what that looks like, here I've got the end time for this talk. I have a little red dot at the top of all my slides that says I'm going too long. Hasn't popped up yet because I'm not going too long yet. I'm almost there. But this is the kind of operation we're talking about. If you look at the default date, it's today. And if you look at what the set prop thing does, it sets the end time based on the date picker plus the time values. So it's taking the outputs from those input controls and it's cycling it back. But because it's got an imperative action, that's okay. And I don't want to see red dots for the rest of the talk, so here it goes. Now, just the last couple topics. Patch is how we manipulate it without the fancy form controls. It's a way of getting information, kind of like using an update query to say, for this table, for this record, make this change to these fields. There's for all. It's a way of doing iteration, kind of. It's a set operation. It basically says, for all the items in this set, kind of like a set-based query in SQL, do this operation on it. And so there's no guarantee about the order of things between one row to the other. You have to be careful about that. But in general, it's not a problem. In general, you can build queries or build formulas that don't have those dependency issues. And where all this comes together, I don't have a demo for it, but it's commonly done, is offline data. People like to take their data offline, especially on these devices, and this platform is all about mobile devices. You pull in data from SQL or CDS or Excel or any number of sources, and you put it into a collection. And then you can save data on the device locally, per app, per user. And I believe it's encrypted. It's safe to be on that device. Then when that same app comes up again, it can load its data back in. And it gets that tabular data back in. It essentially has that offline store. And so you can create this very crude application where you can move information to the device, go offline, out into the field, interact with it, come back, and when you're back online, you can check to see if you're connected to the net and then upload your changes and cache those changes on the local device. Error handling. PowerApps grew out of Project Sienna, which was kind of a prototyping tool that was built a number of years ago. Back in those days, errors, don't bother me with those. Those are just going to mess up a demo. I'm trying to show something off here. We're putting error handling back in the product. It particularly came acute when the way that Sienna and PowerApps previously used to represent errors was with nulls. Well, databases have nulls, and that's not an error. That's a thing. And we can't just overload null to mean error all the time. So we are properly differentiating those two. And so there's a new function in the product called if error. It's kind of a try-catch. If you get an error, then you can provide a different value instead. There's a new notify function, or if you look in the product right now, it's, I believe, send error, show error, that allows you to throw a banner so that you can tell the users a problem. We're renaming it to notify to make it a little bit more generic, so you can send messages, warnings, and other things besides just errors. But this is just the first step. We are talking about global error handling. We're talking about being able to get the error context. What is the message? What's happening there? We're doing a much better job with error handling. Because to date, we have done next to nothing with error handling, which has been a big problem. So there's more to come in this regard for sure. And I'm pretty much done. And we can take questions for the rest of the time. There's a number of session resources here. PowerApps.com is your starting point. The community has a bunch of information. The documentation has a bunch of information. The community in particular is a great resource to tap into. These have all happened, so go enjoy the recordings of them. This is the last one. But there's a number of, we have done these talks at Ignite and other places as well. Those are also online on YouTube. We're big into producing videos, so you'll see a bunch of those, a bunch of webinars, a bunch of blogs, but these talks will be very useful to you as well. And with that, I don't know if you can still win an Xbox or not, honestly. This one's fuzzy too. That's bizarre. Okay, that's my talk. Thank you for attending. Thank you for your quiet attendance, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Yep. Yes. Yep.
Is there going to be updates to allow for
Yes. There's two things coming in that regard. The question was, right now, if you want to duplicate logic, you have to cut and paste it. You have to have multiple copies of it. There's no way to centralize it. I showed a macro thing in the rule generator. It's a first step in that direction. We literally call those macros in the code. The only thing preventing us from letting you use them more broadly is we don't have UI for defining them yet. We're working on that. I think that'll come soon, but it's not the top priority right now, but it's definitely on our radar. The other thing we're working on is components. So as an author, you can say, take these 5 controls, make them a component, and I'll have one copy of that in my app, and then I can instantiate it on multiple screens, like a menu bar or a header, and each one can have its logic inside of it to look a little different for each of those screens. But you can update the one source, and they all get that propagated to them. So we're definitely thinking hard about how to make that easier. Yep. Yes. Yes, you can. So the app on start, which it's a little funny. It's on the first screen. Down here you see on start. It's really not associated with that screen, but we put it here because it was a convenient place to place it. There's no app object, which would have been this convenient for it, so that's where it goes. If you delete this screen, you come back in, it'll be on whatever the new first screen is. It's an app level setting. But in that thing, you can do whatever work you want to do, and at the end of it or in the middle of it, you can say navigate to another screen, and that will become the new screen that'll show up when the app is launched. So you can circumvent the normal processing. Yes. Uh-huh. Yes. So the question is about multi-form factor and being able to have something that adapts or responsive, that kind of ilk, I think. That's on our roadmap as well. There'll be some baby steps taken this summer, I believe, maybe 2 months, 3 months from now, where you can write an app that's unlocked from the constraints of how it was defined, and it can adapt to the width and height of whatever viewport it ends up in. And you can write formulas based on that say, okay, we're in 4K, whatever that means, and then you can have you can either scale or you can decide to keep them the same scale and just have more of them. And that's the intent is to take advantage of that extra real estate. Right now, we just scale everything. So on a big TV, a 50-inch TV, it just gets huge, and that's not terribly useful. It should do a more graceful mode in that way. But it'll be a baby step. The full-on responsive thing we would like to do as well. We've got designs for doing it. We just have not had a chance to implement those yet. And your comment about stability, at least 50% of the team has been on performance and stability for the last year. And as of Ignite, it was up to 70% for a good 6 months. So it's job number one for our mind, which is partially why you don't see so much progress in the features. We deliberately said, no. We'll do the most important features to keep us going, to unblock people, but in general, we are all about making this platform very reliable. Yep. Yeah, it's one of those things. The fact that it hangs here, the fact that there's not a button to say do it now. There's all these things, these low-hanging fruit. You're just like, why haven't you done this yet? And it's just, it's higher priority. It's just priorities. It's definitely coming. Yeah. Be able to directly run queries. That also is something that's on the radar, but that I don't think will happen anytime real soon. It probably won't happen this year. Yes. Yeah, views, and then we'd very much like to do stored procedures directly. I showed it with Flow, but I'd like to be able to do it without having to go through that step. That would be helpful as well. The connector actually has a bypass mechanism, but they've opened up for us. It would not take that much work for us to directly be able to call SQL. We just haven't gotten to it. Sorry, what was the question? Yeah. You create the order item, and you add it to that collection, you add it to that table, and when you save the overall order, it will automatically add those to the foreign table. Yes. It'll batch save and do all the right things. Yep. Mm-hmm. That's the design. It's not all there yet, but that's where we're headed. No, so the work for relationships is intense for a particular connector. We're starting with CDS. Eventually, we will do, I think, SQL and SharePoint. Those will be the next two we would do. Yeah, you can wire up yourself. You can handle the foreign keys and do that wiring on your own today. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It would still work, yes. Yeah. So there's various explanations for that. When Collect in particular comes from Sienna, and when that was being built, Bill Gates and a bunch of other people that were senior at the company kept hounding the team, telling them, thou shalt not call it tables, you shall not be a database product, you're going to be something else. And so they deliberately avoided database terms and database functionality. So that's where that came to pass. Patch is inspired by OData. That's how you do operations of updates, is through OData, and we use OData behind the scenes to do that. So that's where that came from. But yeah, I agree with you. If you're a SQL person, it's like, this is odd. It's a little different. Yeah, it's a good story to tell. Yep. Yeah.
Brand name. So you've got multiple cores.
Yes.
On the same brand name.
Yep.
Obviously, again, going back to the previous question.
Yeah.
Is there vision to add some basic CSS styling?
Yeah.
So you can literally change it, it will replicate across all the controls.
Yeah, not so much CSS, but being able to say that the base colors are these, the base fonts are these, and that things default from those, or they're available in formulas so that the color can be equal to the theme dot primary color or something, and to be able to wire like that. Sorry? Yeah. So that's a direction we're definitely headed. It hasn't bubbled to the top yet. The component stuff will help that in that you can create that header that you can centrally control, and then it'll just replicate through. Another thing people do today is they'll create a variable on the onStart or somewhere else that captures the color value or the font size or something, and then they can centrally control it there and have it replicate throughout the app. But it's ugly. It's not perfect. Yep. Yes, that as well. So the question was, can people create their own templates? Will we be able to create their own templates? Yeah, we very much want to go there. Templating is something that the model-driven, the dynamic side does better than we do. We're trying to pick up some of that stuff in Canvas apps as well. You're welcome. Versioning, you can version the apps today. So if you go back to the portal, and you wait a while. Let's try this one instead. Oh, this will be better. The Girl Scout cookie app. That's my daughter's app. Details. These are all the versions. I'm embarrassed there's that many versions. But those are all the versions, and the last one is the one that was published as live. Yes, absolutely. So you could, if I were to go make an edit right now, it'd be on top of that published version, and I can have drafts, and at some point I can decide, okay, publish that version, and that becomes the main deal. So, yeah, any editor can see these versions. And was authorized to edit that app can get to these. So you can collaborate. I'm not going to tell you it's a great ALM story or anything. It's not. Yeah, it's something. It's a good starting point. But we have a long way to go with our ALM story. It's got to be a lot stronger than it is today. And we are hoping to get a bunch of that from the dynamic side. One of the things we want to do is be able to take a Canvas app and package it with a solution for ISVs to be able to produce those. And that's something that will be coming, hopefully, this year. Yep.
So you mentioned there's a new version of the Common Data Service.
Yes.
Is that available right now?
Yes, it is.
So our customers haven't been utilizing that yet. So would it be possible just to delete that and create a new one in our environment, or
Create the old one and create a new one?
create a new one? So whenever you create a new one, you get that version 2, right?
Oh, so if you create a database, if you just provision an environment, there isn't a database automatically created. You have to. That's an extra step you would take to create the database.
Right. So we can delete the old one and just create a new one.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. You can't even create the old ones at this point. You can only create new ones. Yep. CDS. Yes. Yeah, we're not, we think CDS is going to be a great place for people because well, take for example, I work with a bunch of Access Web App customers, which is being deprecated right now. They were accustomed to having server-side logic, the ability to have triggers. That's something you can do with CDS, and you can easily wire that together. Now, you can create a Sprock in SQL to do that too, and that's how Access Web Apps did it, but it's harder. So things like calculated columns, roll-up columns, server-side logic, packaging, auditing, an ALM story. There's a bunch of stuff that CDS brings with it, which we think are going to be beneficial to that kind of an audience. But SQL will always be there, and we'll always support SQL. It's a great database. We love SQL. Most of the production apps today are on SQL because it's so solid and so stable. And that won't be going away. So at one level, yeah, we promote CDS. We think it's a great place for your data. But SharePoint's fine too, and SQL's fine too. And we're not going to be rigorous, it has to be in CDS. It will not be like that. For the P1 SKU of CDS, yes. Yeah, so some people already have the SQL, they already have the SharePoint. So the economics, they may already be in a different place, maybe. I'm just saying we're not going to, from a technological standpoint, I don't think we're going to be specific about it. We're not going to say that this only works on CDS. We'll invest the most probably there, like the relationship work is going there first, for sure. But you can do relationships in SQL. People have been doing it for decades. P1 is not in Office, but Office SKU you can build apps on SharePoint, for example, and I think on SQL without using CDS. I believe you can to some degree. I believe so. Other questions? I think there's a party and probably some flights to catch, so I'll let you go. Thank you very much.